appreciate that. All right. Bonnie had a friend who had a miscarriage. She was a good friend. And she called her up and she told her the details, told her what had happened. And she wasn't telling, this friend wasn't telling very many people. So Bonnie drove over to her friend's home and she made a batch of cookies. She went over, she was there. She helped with laundry. She tried to listen. She tried to pray. And she stayed until she felt like it was time to go. And she left. And the next few days, the next week, she tried to really stay in contact and be a support. Her experience through that entire time was that while she was trying and doing her best, she felt so inadequate. She felt like everything that she was offering somehow wasn't good enough. Adam, I'm not using real names with these stories, but Adam was a missionary, had given this massive piece of his life to live in a different culture and be with people in an immersive way, and had given up quite a lot in order to do that, had also received a lot. And a lot of people may have looked at Adam and said, wow, there's a real hero. There's someone that I would try to emulate. And yet, sometimes deep down, Adam struggled with feeling like what he had done and what had actually happened in his missionary context, like it had been good enough. Linda, she showed up every week at the church building and did all kinds of quiet tasks. If she could find something that needed done in the building, things put away, things cleaned, things organized, that was her gig. She knew that she wasn't a teacher. She knew that she wasn't the speaker. If you asked her to pray, she got so nervous that she could hardly find the words. And yet, she was faithfully, quietly there every week doing these tasks. And yet, there was this sense, all that stuff, those things I do, it's not really good enough. It's right, I should do it, but it's not really good enough. Have you ever known someone who has this conundrum going on, or maybe you say, man, I feel like I've lived this, where we do something that we know is good. We know it's right. We know that we have this sense, I should do this. And yet, after we do it, for some odd reason, as we finish that experience and as we process it, there's this lingering, lurking question, was that good enough? Does that matter? Does that have any real value to God, what I just did? I know people who, in my estimation, I look at their life and I say, wow, you are making immense sacrifices and you're being intentional. And yet, some of those folks, as I've gotten to know them, they've shared these kinds of struggles. Just this sense of, I know what I'm doing is right. I feel called to do what I do, and yet there's still this lingering sense. Is it good enough? it's not something that people broadcast. You don't go around telling people this, like, hey, I did this week and I still kind of struggled. But for some people, it's there. Maybe you know someone who's responded in this way. You say, hey, I really appreciate it when you did this or did that. And they say, oh, it's nothing. Well, does that characterize a bit of the way that they really feel for some odd reason about the way that they're able to offer who they are, their gifts, their abilities, their time? Like, oh, it's nothing. It's not quite what it should be. Why is it? Why do we do this? Why do we feel this way? We could say, well, it's just low self-esteem, and chalk it up as something there. It could be that we are comparing ourselves to all kinds of people in our lives and saying, man, I just don't measure up to my peers or my mentors or my parents. And yet, I don't know if that's it completely, because we all know people with different skills. People who we would say, they sure don't have the skills that I have, and yet we wouldn't look down on them and say, well, what they have to offer is of no value. And yet, when we look at ourselves, sometimes we can have those kinds of lingering questions. Now, we could say it's comparing the amount of what we have to offer. And sometimes that feels like resources. If we don't have money, or if we don't have time, or if we don't have just physical ability, we might say, I would like to be able to do more, but I just can't. And so we discount ourselves. We say, I feel like what I'm offering just somehow is not good enough. And yet we wouldn't do that same thing with someone who's in the depths of poverty to a further degree than whatever our struggle is. We wouldn't say to them, well, you just don't have anything of value to offer to God or to others. We wouldn't even think those kinds of thoughts. So how does this struggle reveal something about the way we feel about God, something about the way we feel about other people? Maybe you say, well, when I'm thinking that kind of stuff, it's just because I know my own inadequacies, and I see all the people that I failed to connect with, and I see the tasks that I didn't accomplish, and those things are like right in front of me. Whether we like it or not, we live in this world, and it's constantly pulling out the measuring tape, so to speak, and then it's ascribing value to what people are able to do and what they're able to accomplish. It's ascribing value to everything. And so the way we all live in this world is we're taking bits and pieces of that and we're saying, what matters? And we take bits and pieces of what someone else said matters. And then we take bits and pieces of what we think matters. But could the real struggle be this question, what matters to Jesus? Like, how does Jesus measure my life? Here I am, I'm living, I'm doing the things that I'm doing. And how does Jesus measure the things that I'm doing? Is he measuring, is he ascribing value to my life the way that my parents ascribed value and measured my life? Or the way that my boss does? Or the way that my friends do? And we could go on and on and on, filling in the blanks there. There are these two stories in the Gospel of Mark that we're going to look at. And in these stories, there are two women. And they both have something, and they both offer it. They offer it as some kind of a gift. And they both captivate Jesus. He's completely taken with the way that they offer what they have. And as we look at these stories, I want you to be asking, what is it that Jesus sees? What is it that Jesus is recognizing? What are the glasses that Jesus uses? So, If you want to follow along, we're going to start with the story in Mark 12. It starts in verse 41. But I would invite you to imagine this. So it was around Passover time in Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, around Passover time, it could feel like almost a state fair, but the size of a big city. The population could almost triple. And the temple was pretty much the center of the action. It was just buzzing with activity. And Jesus headed into the temple and went and found a place to sit down across from the temple treasury and sat down for some good old-fashioned people watching. Airports are a great place to do people watching. But if you don't have an airport handy, then the temple treasury at Passover time, that'll do the job. So Jesus sat down just watching characters, loud people, shy people, rich people, poor people, fancy people, stylish people, young people, old people, people who wanted to be noticed, people who didn't want to be noticed, people of all shapes and sizes, people who seemed to almost get a high off of dumping their coins into the temple treasury and watching everyone else's reaction. Like, are they hearing how many clanks and clinks? Are they noticing me? Look at me, look at what I'm able to give. The temple would have been a people watcher's dream. Molly and I have a game that we like to play in airports. It's a terrible game. It involves a lot of stereotyping. As we watch people walk through the airport, we say where they're from and what they're doing with their life. And we don't go ask them, hey, here's what I guessed. Am I right? But we like to watch people and just kind of imagine what's going on, what's happening in their story. Now, who knows if the disciples were doing any people watching at all? But Jesus wasn't teaching, he was people watching. So maybe the disciples are off taking a bathroom break or getting a snack or just talking amongst themselves. Out of all the people that were coming and going with this religious zoo, people everywhere, people putting loads of money into the temple treasury, Jesus was taken by this poor widow. She was a nothing. She was a nobody in her world. She had nothing. She shuffled in, probably unnoticed by most people. And that was probably the way she preferred it. Her struggle, a widow in Jesus' day, would have been for survival. And yet there's something deep down inside of her that said, I want to go to the temple, and I want to give. I want to put what I have, give something, put it into the temple treasury. Was she thinking of herself as all that good as she did this? Was giving something that she had done as a little girl, going to the temple treasury and giving? Did it connect her to her deceased husband? Was it something they had done together, and when she came, she felt that connection? Or was it an expression of dependence on God? God, I'm a widow. I don't have much of a shot here at life in my context. Here I am. I'm giving all I have. She dropped her 2 small coins, a fraction of a penny, into the temple treasury and started making her way out of the maze. Nothing, nobody to see, but Jesus couldn't get his eyes off of her. Just captivated by her and what had just happened. And out of all the people and everyone there was to see, he was completely taken with what she had just done. And he called his disciples over. Hey, do you see that lady? Do you see her? Did you just get to see what happened? Had they even been watching? And he pointed out, he said, listen, I'm telling you the truth here. that woman, that widow, she put more into the temple treasury than all these other people with their coin bags and all the dumping and pouring and clanking. They gave out of their wealth, but she just gave out of her poverty. She just gave everything, all she had to live on. And Jesus was completely captivated by what he had just seen, what he just witnessed. He was looking through completely different glasses, because if you could just like pause that moment, no one else was looking at that widow with the wow factor. They didn't notice her. That wasn't what they zoomed in on and said, oh my goodness, what just happened right now? So what was it that grabbed Jesus' attention? So much so that he had to call his disciples over and say, look at this. Well, not long after that, Jesus was invited to the home of Simon the leper. Now, Simon the leper, like most lepers, it would seem, most lepers that spend time around Jesus end up cleansed. We don't know Simon's whole story with Jesus, but lepers lost their homes. They didn't keep their homes. Lepers ended up at the very bottom of society. And yet, Simon the leper had a home, and he had a table. He invited Jesus over to recline at his table, and he had food to offer him, a meal. It would seem that Simon had kept the name, but perhaps not the condition. And so here they are, they're having supper. It's a special meal. And a woman comes in. We don't even know her name. And she's carrying an alabaster jar. It's this smooth, soft, white stone. And the jar is filled with expensive perfume, pure nard. It's made of valerian root, that family, known to come all the way from India. Perhaps it was like a precious family heirloom. Someone back down the line had made that journey. Maybe it was like an emergency plan, like the financial security. I know that if I get super sick, or if I take a fall and completely break myself, I have this. I can live for an entire year. She could make it at least an entire year if she had to sell it. Whatever her story was, she had not sold it. She was not in that place, the dire straits. She came in, she broke the seal on the jar, poured the entire contents over Jesus' head. And you can imagine the smell just filling the entire room. What kind of thoughts were going through her mind? What kinds of emotions? Was she thinking about the way that Jesus had changed her life up to that point? Was she crying? Was she very emotional? Had she been mulling this over for some time? Or was this kind of a spontaneous thing? I need to do this. I'm going to do this right now. For how many years had she wondered what this jar smelled like? If it was a family heirloom, perhaps for a long time. Whatever the case, she didn't have many moments to savor the smell, to just take that moment in. Because the people at the meal, perhaps the disciples, they were scolding her. Super rude. To them, this smell and this act, it just smelled like money down the drain. And they were looking at this and saying, do you know how many good things could have been done with a whole year's wages right here? How many poor people could have been helped? It was just a waste. You did not just think this out, what you just did. And you can imagine how crushing it felt to this woman to do something so deeply from the heart and to be publicly reprimanded. And not only reprimanded, but have this gift that was so much so from the heart just be called a waste. But Jesus was taken with this. He was completely captivated by it. Once again, he stopped all their complaining. Guys, leave her alone. He came to her defense. And he named what she had just done. He called it beautiful. What she just did was beautiful. Now, all the people at the dinner, they were pulling out their measuring sticks, so to speak. They were ascribing value to what she had just done. And they were saying, yeah, there was absolutely no value to what you just did. It'd be negative in value. But Jesus wasn't looking at it that way. He was captivated by this so much that he wanted to memorialize it. He wanted people to remember what had just happened for generations to come. And he quoted this old text in Deuteronomy 15, verse 11. You can look at it. You should look at it. Deuteronomy 15:11. Here's what it says. It says, there will always be poor people in the land. That's the beginning of the verse that everyone remembers. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in the land. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in the land. Jesus was not like excusing rich people from caring for poor people. That verse has been twisted sometimes. But he was just recognizing that God's call is to be open-handed, and he was ascribing value to the way that this woman had been open-handed towards him. Now, did this woman understand what she had just done fully? I wonder if she was surprised by what Jesus said next. He reframed what she had just done as an anointing for his burial. What? If we could, we've got our remote, right? If we can just fast forward the story and go through the Last Supper and the arrest, the flogging, the brutal crucifixion, and the death of Jesus, and if we could hit pause at Joseph of Arimathea and this task that was before him, as he is wanting to take Jesus' completely battered body off of the cross. There had been so much violence done to this body. How do you not do more violence to it? Like pulling nails out of flesh. How does that not feel like you're still messing it up? And as this stiff body was coming down off of the cross, did Jesus' hair fall across Joseph's face? And were his senses filled with that smell, that valerian root, that perfume? Did Jesus still smell beautiful, even in that, like, completely brutalized state? Could he still smell that perfume? This is my anointing for my burial. And in fact, that was the only anointing that Jesus ever received. The Mary and Martha story, they try to show up as Jesus is in the grave to do a little more work. But this is the only anointing he ever received. To be anointed, it really meant something special. It meant something holy. It showed God's presence and God's calling. And that's why throughout the whole story of the Bible, kings were anointed before their enthronement, their coronation, and priests were anointed. And Jesus looked at this act and he said, man, this is beautiful. I like what Brian Zahn says about this. He says, there's something about beauty that sneaks past your defenses. There's something in a beautiful act that it wins your heart. And you might not be able to explain why something's beautiful, but you just know it. Like, you look at it and you say, wow, that was beautiful. And Jesus looked at this moment when everyone's pulling out their measuring tape and ascribing value, and he says, that was just beautiful. So these two women. The first one, if we're just looking at the money, she's bringing fractions of a penny. Just nothing. And she's putting it into the temple treasury. And Jesus is so taken, he has to call the disciples over. Did you just see that? And the second woman, she's giving something that's worth thousands of dollars. But the real value to her might not be money at all. It might be the sentimental value, like the family heirloom, the emotional value. It could be the financial security. The first woman, the widow, she gives her gift. She doesn't even give it to Jesus. She gives it to an institution, that the temple, that Jesus has already said, yeah, that's going to be destroyed. That's not going to last. And he's given such a critique. He said, the leaders of the temple, they are greedily gobbling up the homes of poor widows like this woman. And that's the institution she's giving her gift to. This other woman who gives the perfume, she gives this gift that, like, everyone can smell it, but it could be argued, what good did it really do? That was poor planning. At least the the widow who gave her coins, at least it was going towards something. And yet Jesus looks at these two gifts and he sees something beautiful. He sees a different value. So what is it that Jesus sees as good and right and beautiful? The clue has to do with that text that Jesus reached back to. Deuteronomy 15:11, being open-handed. See, Jesus is not taken with what these women have in their hands. He's taken with the openness of their hands, that they give all that they have. That second woman, she broke her jar, right? Like this puppy's getting used right now. We're not keeping it. And then she pours it out over Jesus. It's interesting, that same language is the language that Jesus uses to describe his love for the world. He says, take this. This is my body. It is broken. Like that alabaster jar. It's broken for you. And then he says, take this cup. This is the blood of my covenant. It's my promise of love to you. And it's poured out for you. Those are the same words, the same actions that this woman did. Broken and poured out. Can you hear the imagery there? And then you look at the hands of Jesus. He said, you'll always have the poor people, and that's why you have been told to be open-handed. And you look at the hands of Jesus on the cross, and they're broken. And they're open, and they are poured out. And Jesus is given everything that he has. So, what if that is what Jesus is looking for when we're asking this question, what actually matters? Like, what is it? What if it's that Jesus is looking for that posture of open-handedness? What does it change? How does it change the way that you see yourself and the way that you see your life? So it means, if that's what Jesus is looking for, he says, I only am looking for open-handedness. It means that you stop focusing so much on what you have in your hands, which is what the world looks at, by the way. What you have in your hands is like your abilities. Oh, this is the stuff I'm good at. And it's the stuff that I have. My money, my possessions, my status, my degrees, my job, my family connections. It's even my personality. Like, oh, I'm shy, but I really have good insight. Or I'm gregarious, I'm out there, I'm extroverted. We could call that the what. And often we're asking the questions about the what we have in our hands, and we're measuring ourselves. Is what I have in my hands really any good to Jesus? And that's the stuff that the world is measuring. But as we look at Jesus, that's not what he's measuring. He's not measuring that stuff. He's looking at, how am I holding that stuff that I have? Are my hands open? Are my hands broken? Are my hands poured out for Jesus, my King, and for the poor, and for the needy? And the beautiful thing is that I think that's what restores the joy for all of us. And that sense of goodness, that sense of beauty about being the person that we're created to be, is that if we're looking at the posture, the way that we're living, and recognizing the beauty in being open-handed with what it is that's in our hands, we don't have to ask in the same way, am I good enough? When we go to our friend's house and they've just had a miscarriage and we're trying to be loving and we really don't know if anything we did was helpful, we don't have to look at what we just did in the same way. We can say, was I open-handed? And when we see that we were, we can say, ha, Jesus sees that as beautiful. That Jesus is taken with that. He's captivated by me living in that way. And when someone comes up to us and they say, hey, I appreciated what you did so much. Thank you so much. We don't have to respond in this way where we say, oh, it was nothing. Like almost push it away. I'm not good enough. Because we remember, it's not the what, it's the how am I holding it. And so we can respond in a different way, which is recognizing how taken Jesus is with this open-handed beauty, and say, it really is a gift and a joy to be able to give what I've been given and to let others experience it. Now, as you think about living in an open-handed way, you think about what do I have and am I open-handed in the way I hold it? I think one of the questions that stirs in our mind, if we think about that very long, is, wow, there's something scary about living in a completely open-handed way, broken, a poured out way, because the obvious question is, will I have enough for myself? Like when you put your last 2 coins into the temple treasury, that's the obvious question. I'm going home and what now? And if you poured your alabaster jar over Jesus' head and that was your family's security, what now? What if something happens? And Jesus knows the depths of the fear of living in an open-handed way, in a broken, poured out way, because his entire life is, I'm open-handed towards the world, and I'm broken. I'm letting my life be completely for others, and I'm being poured out. But Jesus also sees the beauty in that life. And so there's this picture in the book of Acts where people start catching on to this. And Acts 2, Acts 4, you guys know this story, but it's helpful to remember it in this way. They start living in this way where they're all just giving towards one another. You could call it this communal sense where someone has need and someone else says, I'll let my life be poured out for you. I'll step in a variety of ways. And it creates this picture of real beauty. So in our own lives, that's the question that we're left with, is, am I learning how to receive the smile of Jesus and how taken he is, and saying, like, come here, you gotta look at this, just because I'm open-handed? Am I learning to do something quietly and no one notices? Maybe they don't say, hey, I appreciated that. Maybe no one notices, but am I learning how to receive the smile of Jesus as I'm open-handed and realizing he's really celebrating this? And am I learning how to imagine a new kind of living where I'm not ascribing value to what I have in my hand, but the way that I hold it? And does that help me imagine new possibilities? Like, if I'm going to live completely open-handed, how can I be a part of this life that you live, Jesus, where you're broken and poured out? So as we come to our time of open worship, that's the question I want to leave you with is, how is the Spirit speaking this to you in a way that is, first of all, for you, which I imagine that's very personal because this whole subject is very personal. It may be that the Spirit would say something to you that would be for all of us, and that you're sitting there listening and you say, there's a piece of this that I feel compelled to share with the larger body. And if that's the case, I would ask you to be faithful to come and share that with us. But let's spend some time listening. How is the Holy Spirit continuing to speak to our hearts?